think give it another minute to make sure everybody that wants or needs to be on can join us. This shouldn't be a long meeting today, but I think we'll have a good hearing and then a couple updates from post-audit that will be informative. So let's go ahead and get started. First thing on the agenda today was bill introductions. And I haven't heard of any. Nobody has approached me, but just in case somebody is working on something, I'm not seeing or hearing anything. We will be meeting tomorrow also. So if you are working on a bill introduction, contact me and contact Nick to make sure we're getting all the proper things done. We did get our last 3 bills that we introduced last week all turned in. So again, not seeing any bill introductions this time. We'll go ahead and move on to our bills today and open the hearing. And I'm trying to remember, is it 2086? Let's go ahead and open the hearing on House Bill 2086. And to start the hearing off, Nick Myers will give us a summary. He's sent out his written response, but I'm going to let him go over that briefly. And before we get into proponents, we will allow for questions from him. So Nick, if you are ready, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And hopefully everybody can hear me okay. Committee, yeah, as the chair said, you should have a revisor's office bill brief from me in my office on the provisions of House Bill 2086. What House Bill 2086 does is it amends current law and allows schools to maintain supplies of both epinephrine and albuterol and to administer that medication to individuals in emergency situations. It authorizes pharmacists to distribute this emergency medication to schools and exempts pharmacists and those persons who are administering the medication from civil liability when acting under the provisions of an emergency use. So current law actually authorizes schools to maintain epinephrine kits in emergency situations. Schools are prohibited from maintaining these kits unless the school has consulted with a pharmacist and that pharmacist has agreed to supervise the maintenance of the kit and agrees to develop procedures and control and accountability measures for the school. The State Board of Pharmacy is authorized also by law to adopt rules and regulations on the maintenance of these kits. And it also exempts persons who administer epinephrine in emergency situations from civil liability and from being construed as practicing medicine. What this bill does in Section 1, it amends current law to authorize pharmacists to distribute supplies of emergency medications to schools pursuant to a prescription from a physician or a mid-level practitioner that's made out in the name of the school. These stock supplies under the bill could consist of epinephrine and albuterol. Additionally, a pharmacist would not be held liable for damages resulting from the administration of medication in emergency situations. This section also, the amendment in Section 1 would also remove the language that authorizes the State Board of Pharmacy to adopt rules and regulations in relation to the maintenance of just epinephrine kits. Section 2 also amends current law to include anybody who administers albuterol, in emergency situations into that exemption from civil liability and the practice of the healing arts. So persons who are administering albuterol and epinephrine in emergency situations under this bill would be exempt from that liability. Section 3 amends current law to provide new requirements for schools regarding the maintenance and administration of emergency medication kits. For a school to maintain a stock supply of emergency medication, schools would be required to, as I said before, obtain a prescription from a physician in the name of the school, and the physician or mid-level practitioner would be required to review the school's policies and procedures prior to prescribing that emergency medication to the school. School nurses or designated school personnel under the bill could administer this medication to individuals only in emergency situations and only at a school, on school property, or at a school-sponsored event. The epinephrine could be administered to any individual who displays the signs and symptoms of an anaphylactic reaction, and albuterol could be administered to any individual who displays the signs and symptoms of respiratory distress. So schools that maintain these stock supplies under this bill would be required to establish policies and procedures relating to storage, the monitoring and the inventory of the medication, the policies and procedures regarding the administration of the medication, and also establish training requirements for designated school personnel. The bill also allows schools to accept gifts, grants, donations, including stock supplies of epinephrine or albuterol from manufacturers or wholesalers. And committee, that's a quick rundown of the bill, and I'd be happy to stand for questions, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Nick. I guess the main question, you probably have kind of answered this, but I'll ask it in a way just so that everybody on the committee is clear. Is there anything in this bill that is, what's in this bill that's not allowed under current law?
Yes, certainly. So current law allows schools to maintain epinephrine kits. That's under the pharmacist's kind of supervisory responsibility. So that's current law, epinephrine kits. This bill allows for prescriptions to be made to the school to maintain epinephrine kits, and also adds that schools can maintain supplies of albuterol for respiratory distress. So that's kind of the difference between current law. It adds albuterol. It kind of takes it away from the pharmacist needing to be the one controlling the kit and watching over it, and it just more puts it into a prescription type of situation, and the school nurse has control. All
right. We did have a couple questions for you, Nick. First one is from Adam Thomas. Go ahead and take your mask down, Adam.
I don't have a question.
Okay. Question from Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have some concerns about in Section 3 that this could be administered by school nurses or designated school personnel. Is there any definition, or are there any requirements for who the school can designate?
Certainly, Representative Sanders. If committee, if you look on page 3 of the bill, if you have the bill in front of you, and there's a definition for designated school personnel. I'll go ahead and read that for you just in case you don't have that. The definition of designated school personnel means an employee, officer, agent, or volunteer of a school who has completed training documented by the school nurse, a physician, or mid-level practitioner to administer emergency medication on a voluntary basis outside the scope of employment. So there is a training requirement, but that under that definition, it could mean any employee, officer, agent, or volunteer of a school.
All right. Did that get your answer?
Yes. I guess, will we be addressing at all what what all would be involved in that training? Or, I mean, how?
If we work the bill, we can have those types of discussions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So, Mr. Chair,
Representative Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just wondering, outside of a school setting that's covered under this bill, what are the qualifications that a person needs to administer those two medications? I mean, is it something that, you know, is it like EMT or paramedic level, or just, you know, just who is authorized now to administer that?
yeah, certainly. So this kind of ties into that, to the last question too. So if you look on page 4 of the bill, towards,
That's painful.
okay, we'll try this again, committee. If you look on page 4 of the bill, the training requirements, and I should have gotten into a little bit more detail in my brief, would be required on no less than an annual basis for the designated school personnel. And then it also says the training shall include but not be limited to recognition of the symptoms of anaphylaxis and respiratory distress, administration of the medication, calling for emergency responders, monitoring the condition of the individual, notification of the parent, guardian, next of kin, and then safe disposal and sanitation of the used equipment. So those are the training requirements that are listed in the bill.
Thank you.
Let's see. I think we had one more question. Representative Murphy.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also had a question about what about the option for parents to opt in or opt out on something like this?
Yeah, so this bill does not have any opt-in or opt-out provisions. I guess it would be, right now under the bill, it would be in emergency situations. So the emergency medication would only be administered in the case of an emergency. And I know that can be a little subjective, but that's the key to this, what this bill is doing.
All right. Representative Schreiber was next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Nick, how does this coincide with the Good Samaritan laws that we have here in the state?
Oh, I mean, it probably coincides a little bit. And I think current law kind of with the epinephrine, in current law, schools can maintain epinephrine and administer that and not be held liable for good faith actions type of thing. So it's kind of in line with current law, but as I said, it's adding another type of medication. But it still is if you're acting in good faith, you're not going to be held civilly liable for that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. One more. Nick, you're doing a great job, and there won't be much left for the proponents, but Representative Ansel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Nick. Love the idea of big picture stuff that's going on here. My question, Nick, is, and I am just getting up to speed on this. In fact, I had emails complaining about this bill or supporting this bill before I've been able to read it. But it talks about no liability for civil damages here. And that's a little bit, I think, what we were getting into the Good Samaritan law that the good representative brought up earlier. But this may be a question for the proponent, so I'm just maybe planting the seed right now. But whole immunity, if you will, seems like a very big standard versus all four of these folks coming in out of their good nature and doing the right thing for our kids and our educators. But just wondering, is no liability whatsoever normal versus something along the legal standards of negligence or gross negligence and those types of things? So I suspect that legal standard right there may be of some interest as we move forward. So maybe even a little bit of background about what those are. And so, I don't know, that's my general thought as I read through the bill.
So yeah, the liability is tied to that good faith administration of the medication. And it's also, if you're acting in an ordinary, as the bill says on page 2, if you're acting in an ordinary, as an ordinary, reasonably prudent person would have acted under the same or similar circumstances. So there's kind of a reasonableness thing. So any gross negligence or anything like that, this isn't exempting from that, or recklessness. This is not a full-on bar to liability.
Thank you, Nick. I will look at that closer. I did not catch that yet. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome. Representative Featherston.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Nick, I'm wondering, is it pretty much standard practices amongst our schools that parents fill out a form allowing for emergency treatment of their kids at school?
Actually, I don't know the answer to that. There might be a proponent who can answer that. I'll look to see if it's a standard practice across all districts, or if it's a district by district thing too, if we don't get the answer.
We'll see if any of the proponents can answer that in any more detail when we get into their proponent testimony.
Thank you.
All right. Any other questions for Nick before we move on to proponents? I mean, Nick, we're grilling you good here, so you're doing a great job. I'm not seeing anything. So let's go ahead and move into our first proponent. And I'm switching back to my agenda, so apologize with technology here. Crystal Kruger, you are first on my list. Welcome to the committee, Crystal, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman Hubert. I appreciate it. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak today on the need to update current legislation affecting Kansas school nurses. School nurses should be allowed to stock both epinephrine and albuterol for life-threatening emergencies. I am here today as a current practicing school nurse in Olathe, Kansas, to give you a couple stories as to why we need these medications. The first incident happened at one of our Olathe schools last year. A student with a known diagnosis of a peanut allergy had been in weight class. He then proceeded on to his first class of the day. The student had not had anything to eat and had had no known exposure to any peanuts. He left class and made his way to the nurse's office because he could tell he was having the reaction. Once he arrived at the nurse's office, the nurse utilized the student's personal epinephrine and called 911 for emergency assistance. While awaiting EMS, the nurse had to administer the stock epinephrine that she had in her office. Once EMS arrived, the student then required a third EpiPen to get to the ambulance. When the student was on the way to the hospital, the EMS had to administer 2 more epinephrine pens and intubate the student. The student then went on to have a stay at the hospital, and we believe without that stock epinephrine, that student wouldn't have had as good of an outcome. In Olathe last year, we had 11 incidents that required administering EpiPens. Only 2 of those incidents did the student have their own EpiPens at school. 2 of the students had no known diagnosis of anaphylaxis. One of those incidents was actually a staff member, and to this day, we don't know what that staff member reacted to, but we were able to have a stock epinephrine to give that staff member. Well, in Olathe, we are lucky enough to have a stock epinephrine policy, but one of our largest school districts in Kansas, of Wichita, has not been able to find a pharmacist willing to carry the liability due to the current wording of the law. The next story I am going to share with you is from one of our other Olathe school nurses. And I'm going to kind of read her story because I feel like I want her wording to come across on exactly what happened. I had a new kindergarten student last year. I was told she had asthma, but parents didn't think she would need her inhaler at school, and they only had 1 inhaler, which I'm going to interject here is pretty common anymore with some of our families of lower income because inhalers are expensive, so they'll use it for multiple family members. So they planned to send it in her backpack with her every day. I was in the process of working with them to help them get a second inhaler that I could keep at school. When she came to my office one day, she was wheezing badly and had mild intercostal retractions. When she first came to me, her oxygen level was low 90s, which is not a level we want to see in children. We checked her backpack for her inhaler, and it had been forgotten at home. I reached out to both parents. Both parents worked nearly 40 minutes away and said it would be nearly an hour before they could pick her up or get an inhaler to me. Her oxygen level was dropping. It kept dipping into the upper 80s. I informed both parents I would have to call for help. I called for a rapid response team and they came to see her. By the time they had arrived, she was steadily having O2 sats in the 80s and was visibly struggling to breathe. They administered 2 doses of albuterol with a nebulizer before the parents arrived. Parents took her to the doctor and she ended up needing nearly a week's stay in the hospital to recover. Not having an inhaler on hand caused a delay in care that drastically affected her condition. If I had been able to administer albuterol with the onset of her symptoms, it may have saved her a hospital stay. It could have helped improve enough for her parents and had enough time with their nebulizer treatment. Because I had nothing I could give her, she only got worse and ended up in the hospital. I think stock albuterol could have made a huge difference for this student. This new bill would add being able to stock albuterol in school nurses' offices across our state. Our neighboring state of Missouri has had albuterol legislation since 2012. This is the most chronic disease in children. Approximately 7.5 to 8.3% of children have asthma and is the leading cause of school absence. 60% of asthma deaths in children are a result of a sudden asthma attack and can cause a death within 1 hour. As a school nurse, I plead with you to allow me to have access to epinephrine and albuterol. These are life-saving emergency medications that are standard of care across the United States for anaphylaxis and respiratory emergencies. Please help me in keeping our kids safe, in school, and ready to learn. On behalf of Kansas School Nurse Organization, I strongly support this bill.
Okay, before we get into questions, we'll finish up our proponent testimony, and we had one more. Looks like Rhonda is ready to roll. So Rhonda Hutchison, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Greetings. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Greetings, Representative Hubert and members of the Education Committee. My name is Rhonda Hutchinson. I am a Kansas nurse. I'm a Kansas school nurse, and I am president of the Kansas School Nurses Organization. I wanted to talk a little bit on behalf of emergency measures that we already have in place at schools. We use defibrillators, and we also have the ability to carry naloxone, which is an emergency medication to reverse the effects of opioid overdose. I'm getting some feedback. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, okay.
Okay. So the naloxone is already an emergency medication that we keep in the school for those that were worried about opting in and opting out and liability. We already have medications in place and laws in place where we can do some of this stuff already, including the defibrillators for cardiac arrest. I also wanted to address the questions with delegating to employees the ability to administer this medication. We already do this for kids that keep their medications at school. We do it to teachers for field trips. We do it for secretaries because school nurses aren't full-time in every building every day. So kids have these medications at school already, and we already delegate this. And it's something that that we already do. We already know how to do, and certainly we would want additional policies in place for this, but it's not something that is new to the school district. Also, I wanted to tell you of some personal stories. A football game where somebody had a bee sting and no epinephrine to give them. A bus stop student who had never had a history of an allergic reaction before, had a granola bar, and when he got to school was having a full anaphylactic reaction. I work for Wichita Public Schools.
Wait, I'm going to stop you for a second. Somebody doesn't have their mute button on and there's some background noise. Make sure your mute buttons are on. And that way we'll make sure we hear everything you're saying, Rhonda. All right, thank you. Go ahead.
So I've been a school nurse for since 2003, so I've seen many incidences where people could have benefited from medication that we didn't have or used the medication that they already did have. I had a student who ate a homemade sugar cookie for a birthday, not realizing that there was almond extract in it, and had a reaction because they're allergic to nuts. And as many of you know, in the spring when we burn the fields, that's a huge time where I get a lot of students in my office who can't breathe. Many of them have inhalers, but some of them don't. Like Chris said, they only have one. It may go back and forth between two parents' homes or back and forth between school, or their parents just haven't got it done yet. That happens sometimes. And embarrassingly enough, it happened to me this year. And I had to leave work to go to school to give my son his inhaler. I urge your support for this bill. It's a life-saving bill. It adds to the emergency measures that we already have in place. And we talk a little bit about how the legislation differs. The Kansas Board of Pharmacy does not support pharmacists on the current legislation, but they do support this new legislation that would inhibit the barriers that many schools, including Wichita Public Schools, have with getting stock epinephrine in place. And to sum this up as well, the National Association of School Nurses, as well as the American Lung Association, both encourage stock albuterol in the schools. And written testimony has also been sent in by the Kansas Board of Nursing and the Kansas chapter of American Academy of Pediatrics, as well as the Kansas Nurses Association. Again, I urge your support, and I thank you.
All right, we're going to go ahead. You also have written testimony that has been provided to you. And so right now we're going to go ahead and open it up for questions for the two proponents. And I know Adam Thomas, my vice chair, has been helping me with this also, but you can also go on to the participants and raise your hand if you have a question at this time. I am not seeing anything yet. I guess, you know, for me, even on the previous questions, and I see you still on the screen now, Rhonda. You know, you're trained, and I appreciate there's concerns within passing on training to other people that don't have your medical background. And then when we include in some, you know, taking away liability, you know, that I had people raising that concern that we're getting further into where problems could arise. So how would you answer those concerns?
Again, we already do this in the building for students that have albuterol and epinephrine. We already delegate those responsibilities and train those, just as Nick had said. We make sure they know the symptoms and how to use the medication. We do it with teachers who take students on field trips. They have to take their medicine with them. We do it for secretaries because nurses aren't in the building all day, every day. We're absent or sick, or we have more than one building to take care of. So we already do that. And naloxone is an emergency drug that I think has similar legislation that is already in law that releases that liability as well.
Okay, and then that kind of, one of my first questions was, it sounds like things are proceeding pretty well right now with current law, and you're able to do what you need to do. So the question then arises, is this legislation really needed? So I'll let you address that also.
Right. So the Kansas Board of Pharmacy is hesitant to suggest that pharmacists do this. So a lot of pharmacists are hesitant because they're not supported by the Kansas Board of Pharmacy. And so that's the problem. We can't find someone to do the things that the bill, that the current legislation uses the wording a consulting pharmacist. Okay, 49 of the 50 states that have epinephrine law, none of them have this wording. We are the only one, and it is a huge barrier for getting stock epinephrine in our building. And we do not have any legislation for albuterol at this time.
And I might ask my revisor this question. with what she's talking about, is some of this already in rules and regs as far as, is there a statute change that is required, or is there something that through rules and regs that could address some of the issues that are being talked about? I thought, Nick, you might be able to, if you can't answer that, check into that for us.
Yeah, certainly, Mr. Chair. So in current statute, epinephrine with the pharmacist consultant is authorized. Albuterol is not discussed in current law. The Board of Pharmacy has promulgated a regulation to allow, and I just had it up, the opioid antagonist drug to be administered in school. So that's a law through regulation that's authorized, and so
Okay.
yeah.
I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, and that's where I thought even with rules and regs, sometimes we don't need statute change. They can be looked at through rules and regs and then updating those. So that's something we might look into more, but I just thought I'd bring up the question even as we are having the hearing, so that that'd be something to look at in the future. I did see a hand raised, Representative Featherston.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a few questions for our nursing professionals, and Mr. Chair, let me know if I'm out of line asking more than one question. My question for our nursing professionals is regarding albuterol or inhalers. How young of a child have you seen operate their inhaler properly?
Right. So the law, the legislation in place also allows for nebulizers. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but it could also be administered via a mask. So they would not have to coordinate that giving of the inhaler at the time they inhale. So, yes.
Okay, but like, I guess my question is, have you found that small children are capable of operating their inhalers?
Yes, at my school, I've given inhalers with an attachment called a spacer and a face mask as young as 3 or 4 years old in my pre-K area.
Okay, so are you confident that adults could be trained in how to administer an inhaler to students?
Yes, I do it every year. I've been doing it for 13 years.
Okay, and then my last question was, it's been a while since my kids were in school. Do parents fill out a form allowing for emergency treatment of their children?
I'm not sure. I don't remember that.
Okay.
I don't think so, because otherwise I'd have a list of people that I could use my defibrillator on and the ones that I couldn't.
Okay, I couldn't remember. I know there are so many forms at the start of the year, and I have some related to the school nurse, but I don't remember.
Right.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to keep moving. I do see a hand raised here, Representative Stockstill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a question for Ms. Hutchinson. And having raised a child with a very severe peanut allergy, I am extremely familiar with epinephrine. And matter of fact, it probably saved his life on a couple of occasions. So I'm all for having access to epinephrine in schools. My question is, as part of the training, I know, and you know that epinephrine has become ridiculously expensive. And I'm just wondering about the storage facility and how the medicines are stored in schools. Is there a protocol for that? And also you mentioned, and I know this to be true in Shawnee Mission as well, not every school has a full-time nurse. Are people trained to know how to get into the cabinets and so on to get to the medicines that they might need?
Yes, thank you. We, the Kansas school nurses are encouraged to keep all medication locked up. However, the key is readily accessible. For example, in my school, it's just in a drawer, and it's just that added security so that a child doesn't walk in and just use it when you're out of the office for a minute. They're readily accessible, and as far as the expense, we spend $80 or $100 every year or so buying new pads for our defibrillators. We spend the same amount of money, $135 for the naloxone. We drop money here and there for things as well. Epinephrine, though, historically, a lot of schools have gotten a manufacturer to donate those. There are programs for that. Also, PTAs help with that. So that it can be done as a gift as well.
I appreciate that, and I certainly appreciate your efforts in this area, because it does save lives if you have access to those medicines.
Thank you. May I also add, please, Mr. Chairman, that this allows schools to stock this medication, but it does not require them to.
Okay. Question from Representative Shriver. Representative Shriver, did you still have a question? I see Representative Shriver, but I don't hear him speaking. If you don't have a representative question, wave me off. All right, no question from Representative Shriver. How about, well, I'll just say, I think maybe Representative Sanders, did you have another question? And if you don't have a question, wave me off. All right, I don't see your response either way, but if you, no, I'm looking like he doesn't have a question. Anybody else in the committee? And again, if you, Representative Thomas, I see you raising your hand. If you have a question in the committee and I haven't been able to acknowledge you, go ahead and see if we can just proceed by letting you ask that question. I'm willing not, I just don't want to miss anybody. Adam?
Mr. Chairman, do you hear anybody in the committee room?
I cannot. I'm not hearing people speak. That's something we'll have to work on. And
That's my computer. Doing that, I unmuted. Can you hear me now?
yes.
Okay, Representative Sanders has a question, and then
Okay.
Representative Murphy and Representative Estes.
All right, proceed.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Regarding the liability, is there anything on the other side of this? Let's say for whatever reason, the school nurse is not readily available and there's an emergency situation that comes up and the school is unable to take any action. Is there a possibility of liability for inaction on the part of the school? I don't know if that would be for the revisor's office or who that would be for, but that's my question.
See, nobody's jumping in right now. Nick, do you want to give a shot at that?
I'd have to think about that a little bit. You know, if it's grossly negligent or something like that, I mean, you could get an attorney filing suit on behalf of a parent for, you know, a lot of things. But I'd have to think on that if it goes the reverse way.
Okay, well, we'll let you think on that and do some checking. And then if you get more information, just let myself and Deborah know and we'll get that information out to the committee. All right. Adam, go ahead and continue with, if there are people in the room, to acknowledge them and let them speak, answer their question.
Representative Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are either the proponents still online?
I think so.
My question was, are there health issues that a child might have that are unknown? Administering these drugs, could it create another problem? I don't know. I'm just asking. Thank you.
Crystal, I'll answer this first and you can jump in after me. I am not aware of any. Albuterol just dilates and opens up the lungs so that you can allow air to pass through into the lung area. I'm not aware of any. I've been giving it for 25 years. Epinephrine, I'm not aware of any.
I'm happy to jump in. I have a background. I'm actually a nurse practitioner who came back to school nursing, and those two medications are really relatively safe medications. If you do give epinephrine, it is recommended that they be transported just to be monitored at the emergency room. Like we talked about, a lot of times there's more repeated doses needed, but it's very, very relatively safe to give these two medications. And oftentimes, like we talked about, life-saving.
I think we had one more question, and then we're going to try to wrap things up here soon because we do have a couple presentations.
Vestas?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is for the proponents. I've had a few people reach out to me and say, as a parent, they want control out of what their child receives along the lines of, well, I pick this brand because the other brand might give my child adverse side effects. How much of a risk is that, please?
Crystal, did you want to answer that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. The brand names on these two medications, I wouldn't feel like matter a lot. I have I have an asthmatic myself. I will say maybe one brand makes him a little more jittery than another brand, but that's really, as far as the albuterol side, really the only difference. As far as epinephrine side, epinephrine's epinephrine, and from the way I have been told, the only difference in the brands from what I have seen is how they're packaged. And one of the brands will talk you through exactly how to give it. It's called AviQ. And then the other one has it labeled on the label. So really, as far as two medications, I don't feel strongly, as having a clinical background, that the brand of the medication would make a difference in their side effect. I really feel like in the long term, it's going to save their kid's life if it's a medication that's needed. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I don't want to cut anybody off. I feel like we've had a good hearing. Adam, is there anybody else in the room that has their hand raised wanting to ask a question before I close the hearing?
Representative Sanders.
Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. I talked with a pharmacist today, and while he agreed that Adderall was fairly safe, he said in the case of epinephrine, if somebody misreads a student's distress as a panic attack instead of an allergic reaction, that epinephrine can have a very detrimental effect up to and including death. I'd like one of our conferees to speak on that, or maybe both.
Krista, I'll let you talk about that. However, I did have a student, a friend of mine actually, who was playing with his and accidentally stuck himself. And so that happens, but there were no detrimental effects to him. Krista, would you like to talk about that?
Happy to talk on it. I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure exactly what they're referring to as detrimental. It's not, the amount of epinephrine they're given isn't a large enough amount that I could see it stopping a child's heart. It maybe would make them not feel fantastic. And like I said, they would maybe need a trip to the emergency room just to be monitored. But I really clinically, I mean, I was even trying to think of how it would be harmful to them. I know of an example where during a training, instead of having a actual EpiPen, they used an actual EpiPen, but it wasn't detrimental to the teacher that happened to inject it herself anyway. She was fine. There was no problems at all. But if you would like, I can try to reach out to some higher clinicians that I know and find out what their input is. And I'm happy to give you my contact information or send you an email with the information I find out.
That would be great. Thank you.
All right. Committee, I appreciate, and we'll try to get follow-ups as best we can on any questions that came up. And if you have things that you want us to follow up with, you can email or text me or Deborah if you think of additional questions or concerns you have. But with that, we're going to go ahead. I don't think have anybody else listed that was speaking. Everything else was written testimony. Okay, let's go ahead and close the hearing. And thank you for the proponents who spoke on participating and sharing your thoughts and answering questions. We are closing this hearing, and now we're going to move on to Heidi Zimmerman with Post Audit. Heidi, if you could, we've run a little bit long with that hearing. That's great because we had a lot of good questions. But go ahead and go through both of your audits. Did you bring written handouts for the committee if they would so desire to have a copy?
I don't have anything in writing. I could send a copy of the PDF audits to the committee assistant and have those distributed.
And I think we might already have that.
Okay.
I just thought you might have written copies, but go ahead and go through both of the audits and then we'll get into questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm going to start with the unencumbered cash balance audit unless the chair has another preference.
No, that's fine.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to go through these audits reasonably quickly to leave a little bit of time for questions. Like I said, I'm going to start with unencumbered cash balance. This was the fourth audit that was required in the list of required audits by state law for LPA to conduct. And so I'm going to start on page 2 and just give you some really brief background information on what an unencumbered cash balance is. And then I'll talk about what we found. So first of all, state law provides funding to school districts through a number of mechanisms. And state law often requires districts to spend that money from a very specific fund. So when districts receive their funding, typically they transfer it into the appropriate fund, and then they spend and account for those expenditures from that fund. So when the district transfers more funding into a fund than it spends in that year, it creates a cash balance. When a district creates a cash balance, they can spend that balance at any time. Further, unencumbered cash balances can be used for any allowable purpose. And those are the funds that we evaluated in this audit. So districts maintain unencumbered cash balances for a number of reasons. One is that they maintain them to pay for unexpected expenses. They use them to save over time for a large but planned purchase. They use them to manage cash flow. School districts do not receive all their funding at the beginning of the year. It comes periodically through the year. And they maintain them to mitigate instability in funding. So the cash balances allow the districts to continue paying their bills even if funding is late or unexpectedly cut. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about the trends that we found in cash balances. I'm on page 4 if you're following along. We use data from the Department of Education to determine how much unencumbered cash balances districts had in each year from 2009 to 2019. And after adjusting for inflation, we found that total unencumbered cash balances grew $547 million, or 35%, from 2009 to 2019. And that figure on page 4 shows that trend line. We evaluated unencumbered cash balances by the 34 funds that districts report to the Department of Education. And again, after we adjusted for inflation, we found that 96% of the growth in unencumbered cash balances occurred in just 10 of those funds. So on page 5, that figure lists those 10 funds. You can see at the top there, bond and interest and contingency reserve, those blue, the blue section of the row is the growth. And you can see that those two funds are basically the growth drivers. Those two funds alone account for 55% of all the growth that we saw. So we looked at those two funds with a little more depth just to see kind of what was happening there. The bond and interest fund is the fund that school districts use to finance large projects. We talked to the Department of Education about what might be driving that growth, and they gave us a couple of things that might be happening. One is that school construction has gotten more expensive. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics says school building construction has increased by 32% from 2009 to 2019. Additionally, they noted that legislative changes made in 2015 to bond and interest state aid has reduced the amount of state aid that districts receive. So as a result, the district pays for a greater percentage of that project than they would before that change. And to do this, they must raise more revenue, which results in more money in the bond and interest fund over time. The second fund was the Contingency Reserve Fund. That is a fund that districts use to save money for unexpected expenditures. The increase in contingency reserve may be related to district decisions since the 2009 recession. A number of districts told us they increased their cash balances after the recession so they could better manage a cut or delay in state funding. We also looked at balances by restricted and unrestricted funds. So money in restricted funds can only be used for a specific purpose, and that's usually set in state law. Conversely, unrestricted funds can be used for a variety of purchases at the discretion of the district. So on page 7, that figure shows the total cash balances by restricted and unrestricted funds. The blue is the restricted, the light blue kind of sliver at the top is the unrestricted money. So as you can see that each of the 10 years we reviewed, most district cash balances were in restricted funds. So when districts have most of their money sitting in restricted funds, it means they often have limited flexibility in their spending, especially when their needs change. So I'm going to move on to the second part of the audit, which is looking at how districts spent their unencumbered cash balances. So we looked at 25 school districts in depth to see how they spent their unencumbered cash balances from 2009 to 2019. And we identified about $152 million in cash balance decreases over that 10 years. And out of that, we reviewed about $138 million. So of the $138 million we reviewed, 77% of that was spent on a tangible purchase, mostly on building construction, renovation, or maintenance, a little bit on regular operating expenditures, and then a very small amount on equipment. The remaining 23% did not appear to be related to a tangible expenditure. In those cases, the decreases in cash balances occurred when a district simply transferred less money into a fund than they had in the previous years. The last analysis that we did involved comparing cash balances to best practices. The Government Finance Officers Association recommends that districts maintain a total cash balance of at least 2 months of operating expenditures. Best practices also urge districts to consider their risk level when determining how much their reserve should be. Districts that identify more risks should have higher cash balances. We did not review the risks in the districts, though, because risks in individual school districts is subjective and it changes regularly. But we used Department of Education data to determine how the 25 districts' cash balances compared to the best practice of maintaining at least 2 months of operating expenditures. The figure on page 10 shows the results for those 25 districts. So as you can see, the green bars are the 15 districts that met or exceeded that best practice minimum. The red bars are the 10 districts that did not meet that minimum. I do want to note that this best practice minimum truly is the very minimum, because best practices suggest that districts should look at the risk. We didn't look at that risk. So this would be kind of the truly minimal amount that districts should maintain in reserves. So to conclude, it makes sense that districts maintain some cash balances. It's a good financial practice for them to do so. However, how much an individual district should maintain is a little less clear. Best practices, of course, urge districts to maintain some balances, but to consider their risks and then adjust accordingly. So for this reason, it is difficult to conclude whether districts have too much or too little in their reserve. So I can stand for questions now or just move on to the next audit.
Let's go ahead. We're already approaching 2:30. Let's go ahead and get through both of the presentations. That way we make sure we get that at least presented, and then we'll get into questions.
Second audit is the ESL audit. We were asked this year to do 2 audits this year instead of just 1. So the second one is evaluating bilingual expenditures. So first of all, just kind of quick what bilingual funding is. The state provided $42 million in funding for K-12 school districts to serve students who are English language learners. So the purpose of the English for Speakers of Other Language Services is to help students learn English so they can meet state standards. In the 18-19 school year, about 56,000 students were English learners in Kansas school districts. So districts receive state bilingual funding to pay for their ESOL services. They receive that funding based on one of 2 weightings, either the district's head count multiplied by 0.185 or the district's FTE multiplied by 0.395. The Department of Education calculates both of these things for the school districts, and then the district receives whichever amount is more. So federal law requires districts to identify English learners and provide them service. The Department of Education requires that students receive services until they score as proficient on the Kansas English Language Proficiency Assessment, but it's school districts that determine what services the district will offer and then what services each individual student will receive. So to get into the main audit question regarding how much school districts spend, we chose 25 of the state's 286 school districts to look at in depth. We chose these districts for variety in location and size and the percent of their students receiving ESL services. The 25 districts received $21 million in state bilingual funding, but they reported spending almost $31 million to provide ESL services. The figure on page 5 shows the 25 districts and the amount of funding and expenditures each received. So state bilingual funding covered 68% of districts' ESOL program expenditures. Federal funding covered 7%. The remaining 25% was covered with either local funding or other types of state funding. We also looked to see how the school districts spent that money. So we reviewed that $31 million and found that 97% of that was spent on salaries and benefits. We looked a little to see who those staff were, and found that about 60% of that staff were teachers or paras. Another 20% were ESOL teachers. We also examined whether district expenditures were directly attributable to ESOL programs. We looked at this because the state law requires that any money spent from the bilingual fund must be directly attributable to ESOL programs. However, the law does not define directly attributable. But the law does apply to any money deposited or transferred from that fund. So we reviewed in depth about $10 million from those 25 districts. We identified about $600,000, or about 6%, of the dollars that we looked at that were not attributable to an ESL program. So as a result, some districts' total ESL expenditures are slightly inflated because they included expenditures not related to an ESL program. We also looked how the department calculated state bilingual funding, and we found that for the 2 years that we looked at, the Department of Education calculated state bilingual funding accurately and in accordance with state law. We have a few other findings, mostly having to do with outcomes, starting on page 9. So we reviewed about 47,000 students who completed an ESL program to see how long it took them to complete their ESL program. We found it typically takes students 5 to 8 years to complete their ESOL program. To complete the ESOL program means they have tested as proficient on the CELPA. So that time frame, though, is consistent with how long state and national studies we reviewed suggested that it typically takes students to become proficient in English. We also analyzed state assessment results in reading and math for students after they completed their ESL program. Figure on page 10 shows those results. So you can see in both English language arts and math, English learner state assessment scores are below the average of all students. 3 years after completing an ESL program, 76% of the students scored in the bottom 2 levels on the English language arts state assessment. This compares to 63% for all students. Math had very comparable results. Additionally, students who completed an ESL program showed little growth over the 3 years that we evaluated. Most students scored in the same tier in the 3rd year after completing an ESL program as they did in the 1st year. We also asked districts about some of the challenges they face in providing ESOL services, and there were a few things that were noted multiple times. First, many districts told us that some of their English learners have very little formal educational background. As a result, these students may not be working at grade level even in their native language, which may significantly slow their ability to progress to working at grade level in a second language. Some districts reported the diversity among their English learners created unique challenges. So for example, Wichita officials reported their student population includes students who speak more than 100 different languages. And many of the districts reported that finding ESOL endorsed teachers is difficult. Last, we talked to districts about how they evaluate their ESL programs, and we found that although many districts track individual student progress, they do not regularly evaluate the effectiveness of their own ESL programs. So to conclude, from a compliance perspective, we did not find many problems with how bilingual funds are distributed or spent. Almost all the 25 districts we evaluated, those supplement by state bilingual funding with additional types of funding. Additionally, assessment outcomes, though, for ESOL students do tend to lag behind all students. Consequently, a more detailed evaluation of ESOL outcomes and expenditures could be helpful in determining whether state funding is set at the right level and whether districts spend bilingual funding on effective services. So that concludes my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Heidi. I'll just start off. Did your study at all look at the issues that have arisen with the lockdown that we're had last year and with the different approaches with learning this year with hybrid and remote learning? Is that at all a part of this study?
The ESL audit does not include that. We were conducting this audit just as the lockdowns occurred. So we were talking to school districts in March and April of last spring. So, and obviously they didn't do state assessments last year either because of the lockdowns. And so this does not include any issues that might arise from students being out of school.
Okay. Is it possible to see if we can get any kind of feedback that would supplement, or is that out of the question as far as, I didn't know if we could send out to the 25 school districts to see what unique challenges have arisen past your post-audit with what schools are dealing with now. So if it's possible, great, and if it's not, I understand.
I don't believe we can conduct any additional audit work without an approved audit statement.
Okay.
Or audit proposal. I could note, though, that when we talked to the districts in March and April, that's about the point where we were doing Zoom calls with a lot of these districts, and we asked them how things were going with their distance learning, and specifically what their how optimistic they were about their ESL students specifically. And many of the districts, in fact, all the districts we talked to, said they had some real concerns about their ESL students. For a lot of those students, the only place they hear English is at school. And so there were concerns that if they're not there, there would be some significant setbacks with these kids and being able to learn English and then staying on track academically. So a little bit anecdotal, but they were certainly raising those concerns in March and April.
Thank you. Representative Wolfmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your presentation. My question is on your first audit on the unencumbered cash balances. So I assume that there are some of those funds that schools were able to use for PPE and things related to COVID-19.
This audit was conducted at the same time that the ESL audit was conducted, so we were a little early. However, the district's contingency reserve funds, that's a fund meant for unexpected expenditures. Certainly districts could use that money for these very unexpected expenditures if they needed to do so.
Fortunate that these districts had planned ahead for an emergency such as this and had those funds available. Thank you very much.
Representative Wolfmore, if you could speak into your mic, it would help.
I will from now on. I am done speaking. Did you need me to repeat anything?
I think we're good. I just, for all the committee members, make sure you speak into your mic.
I certainly will. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just was wondering on the unencumbered cash balance audit. The school districts there on the chart, how did you select the districts to be reviewed?
We selected them mostly just to get good balance across the state. So essentially, we wanted to have a group of 25 school districts that kind of represented the state in total. So we chose districts that were kind of a variety. So districts on both sides of the state, east and west, some small districts, some big districts, some urban districts, some suburban districts. I don't think Wichita was in this group. Wichita we usually choose for a reason because they're so large. Most of these districts were simply chosen because they met some sort of demographic profile that we wanted to fill to make sure that these 25 districts kind of looked like the state as a whole.
Thank you.
Further questions? Representative Sanders.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm a freshman, and before I ever got up here, I've heard for years there was a use it or lose it mentality relative to school budgets. Relative to the unencumbered cash balances, did you see any evidence that any of the districts were spending late in the school year with the thought of use it or lose it?
We didn't really look to see kind of when they were spending their funds. I can tell you for the general fund, districts do tend to zero out their general fund, not necessarily by spending the money, but by moving it out to another fund, because anything left in the general fund will be held against them the next year. So they tend to zero out their general funds, move those funds somewhere else. Like I said, that doesn't mean they spent the money. It may just mean that they transferred it to another fund. So we did see a lot of transferring for those purposes, but we didn't necessarily look at exactly how they were spending those things.
Is there any opportunity for them to carry over their money to the following year?
Yes, most funds can be carried over to the following year, which potentially would indicate that districts have their own priorities about how they spend their money, and it tends to vary from school district to school district. But the fact that districts can carry most of their money from district to district, they can essentially just sit on the money. They can put it in a fund and hang on to it there, spend it later, spend it the following year, or spend it years and years later, would probably indicate that districts may not feel quite as much pressure to spend it or lose it because they can sit on that money.
Thank you, Mr.
I
Chairman.
have just a follow-up question. With funds, and I know we're over $1 billion. Are there rules as far as they're moving from funds to funds, as far as where the money is being parked? Can they invest these funds? Is there any rules and regs or control over if that's happening, or is this money just being stashed away in accounts? I've had some people asking me questions about, can the funds be used in any way that's not in ways that's intended?
We didn't look specifically at whether or not districts can invest their money, so I don't have an answer to that question. I know that school districts, we did see some variation in districts in terms of where they park their money. Some like to kind of spread it through a lot of different funds. Some tend to put their money mostly in the contingency reserve fund. Some funds, as I said during the presentation, some funds are restricted. And so when their money is in that fund, they may only be able to spend that money for a specific purpose. So for example, bilingual, once it's in that fund, they need to spend it for bilingual services. Special education is another one of those. And then there are more general funds like the general fund or the contingency reserve fund, where they can put that money and then spend it for a wide variety of purposes at the district's discretion. So there are some funds that are very specific about how they use them, and they need to use them in accordance with law, and then a few other funds that are much more kind of wide-ranging.
Are there any checks and balances as far as funds are being moved around to make sure that they are following state law?
Probably not as many as you'd like. The Department of Education does not do a lot of auditing of expenditures. They do look high level at expenditures. Potentially, if you have the district in, say, an at-risk fund or a bilingual fund who is really wildly spending that money outside of those purposes, the Department of Education might catch that and tell them to stop doing that and reassign their money, tell them you need to reassign these expenditures to something else. But there's not a lot of detailed look at how districts are spending their money.
Thank you. Further questions from the committee? And Adam, help me out if there's anybody in the room that's raising their hand. I'm not seeing anything and you're shaking your head no. So if you do have additional questions, get them to myself or to Deb and we will get answers for you. But Heidi, we appreciate you taking the time. And for anybody, I think you said that you do have some paper copies if anybody is wanting something instead of a PDF file, or if you do, if you could leave some in my office, that would probably make some available for anybody that's wanting something that they could look at again or give to somebody. So
I could bring a couple paper copies over at some point. Leave them with your committee assistant.
All right, thank you. Committee, we are done for today. We are meeting tomorrow and have another hearing. I might work with my assistant Deborah and revisor and research to get you some information from the Education Budget Committee that we heard yesterday. I feel like it's at least for you to be aware of some information even on challenges with remote learning and what's going on with, across the state. So we will try to get that information available to you and then maybe have an update from Nick to make sure you know what's in the different PDFs that we will be providing you. So look forward to that tomorrow, and then we'll add that on after the hearing tomorrow. With that, committee, we are adjourned, and we'll see you tomorrow again at 1:30.